Things I wish I knew about fermentation temperature. Okay. I think basic things about fermentation temperature that everyone needs to know are what happens when it gets too hot and what happens when it gets too cold. If it gets too hot, generally the yeast will get stressed out. They will throw off flavors. Sometimes that's spicy flavors or phenolic. Sometimes it's esters that can taste like all kinds of weird. Sometimes you want that with your yeast, but generally you don't. Generally, you're looking for a clean fermentation, especially if it's a wine meter cider. Sometimes you do want big expressive yeast character in beers. And so you don't want it to get too warm, so warm that it exceeds what's best for the yeast in how it creates its flavor profile that would complement or detract from your brew. Now, if it gets too cold, the yeast kind of go into hibernation or dormancy, and you'll see them falling out of suspension and not really fermenting. Now, getting too cold doesn't really stop fermentation, really. It just slows it down dramatically. And so if your yeast are colder than what they need, you may get a sluggish fermentation, you may get a kind of stalled out fermentation, you may get an incomplete fermentation. So you do want to keep your yeast within that band, and every yeast kind of has a range that it likes to operate in. If you look up the spec sheet for the yeast that you're using, or look up the Scott Labs winemaking handbook, there's information about preferred temperature ranges and generally like stuff about phenolics and esters and things that the yeast will create. And so you really want to ferment your yeast within the temperature band that it wants to ferment at. And really, stability beats perfect. And so as long as you can keep a consistent temperature, maybe you're on the high range, maybe you're at 74, 75 degrees in your house. That's generally going to be mostly okay for most yeasts, as long as that's a stable temperature. If you're fermenting something that's high potential alcohol, like a big sack mead or a big wine or a big barley wine, those can be susceptible to temperature spikes because as yeast gets starved for nutrient, it can create more heat during fermentation. And so that's why we often recommend staggered nutrients, especially for meads and wines, where you're adding a little bit of nutrient every day for the first few days, and it helps keep that temperature stable so that the yeast aren't creating their own temperature spikes. Temperature is super important in fermentation. All about consistency. That's really the name of the game.